I have a problem. I have a problem that I think maybe a lot of people have. Um, and that is there's some rules in D&D 5e that make certain things difficult, right? Now, this kind of came to mind because I watched a Taking 20 video where Cody on Taking 20, if you don't know who he is a very good D&D YouTuber who's been doing it for a little while, and I really enjoy his videos. I kind of vibe with it a lot, and apparently he's been DMing for like 20 something years, I think. So he's got way more experience than I do. But he was kind of talking about um, one of the things that he had like a big problem with. I think the video was called like "Why HP is Stupid" or something like that. And I'm not here to bag on HP, all right, and neither was he, because he kind of talked about immediately after he introduced that. He was like, I think HP is necessary. I think there's really no way to work around it. And if someone came up and was like, "Oh, I'm a dungeon master. I don't use hit points. Please join my game." Don't join that game. Run away, because it'd be really difficult to get rid of HP, and that's really not what I want to talk about today. But he mentioned that because, well, let me give you a scene, right? Let me lay a scene out for you. So the party's been chasing the BBG for several weeks now, chasing him from town to town, always missing him by 2 or 3 steps. And they finally are able to track him down to this town. This party of 4 or whatever come across the docks. It's late at night, and they see him standing at the edge of a pier waiting for a boat. They think now's the perfect time, and they start to corner him and rush him. They exchange a few words for a while, and just when you think that you're about to go into conflict, out from behind a few boxes comes the big bad evil guy's sidekick, his right-hand man. And he's carrying a knife pressed against the throat of a young girl, a girl who the bard in the party recognizes as his sister. So he's stressed out. The big bad guy says, "Not another step, or she dies. She loses her, her whole head. Just gonna cut it right off." He's wielding like a big cleaver, right? The big bad evil guy gets on his boat and starts to sail away, and the party's left hopeless. If they move a step closer, there goes the bard's sister. But that's not the way it's going to work out, right? With the current mechanics, the way that it's kind of set up is the party attacks. Maybe the girl dies. She goes down to 0 hit points, but the cleric can just healing word. She's okay, and then everything's fine, And it's a really stressful situation that if you're reading it in a book or watching it in a movie, you would know that that dude has the upper hand, and maybe the party wouldn't attack. Maybe they just back off and say, "Okay, we'll leave you guys alone. Just please give her back." Whereas in D&D, because of the way that the rules are kind of set up, it's really easy to just say, "No, screw you. We're getting that girl. You can frick off. We're gonna kill you." And that, me personally, if I was reading that in a book or watching it in a movie, I'd be like, well, it's kind of cheap, right? Well, when you're a player in that situation, you think, I've got the upper hand. This is cool because there's no real danger here. But real danger really kind of makes a better story. And that necessarily wouldn't be like a really cheap way to make danger, like a really cheap way to say like, oh, there's, big high stakes, is to be like, all of a sudden you can't cast spells and all your magic items are, they turn to ash, and, the monk loses his hands, so he can't punch. Like that's kind of a cheap way, because now you're just taking away from the players all the things that they worked really hard to get really good at. And that kind of sucks. So that's not really like, it is danger, but to me it's kind of like a cheap way of danger, right? So you can't really say like, oh, your healing word doesn't work. Why? it should work, right? Because a knife like that only does like 1d4 plus strength, so like a maximum of 8 hit points. The like an average character, let me see if I remember this correctly. I think like common royalty have like an average of 9 hit points. So she takes the hit points, but she's still alive. She got a knife held to her throat. Could have just cut her head right off. But there's not really like a good way to do that. Another example he gave, and again, that was his example. I'm not taking credit for thinking up of that example. Go check out Taking 20. But another example he gave is like, what if you're a dark mage and you have been tracking this high-profile person that you're trying to assassinate, and just at the right moment, while he's like giving a speech or whatever, you, dominate person on him. He grabs his hand crossbow, holds it up to his throat or the bottom side of his head, and fires a bullet or a bolt right into his head. If you read that in a book or watched that in a movie, that man is dead. He is dead, and there's no way around it. But in D&D, a successful crossbow hit only does 1d8 piercing. Again, common royalty have 9 average hit points. Man's got a crossbow bolt sticking halfway through his jaw, and he's just like, I feel weak. Who shot me? Why did I do that? No, that man is dead, and it probably popped out the top of his head as it went through. So here's what I propose. This is kind of a homebrew thing that I've thought of over the past 2 days. It's nowhere close to perfect, nowhere close to official, and I think there's a lot of room for improvement, but it's just an idea, just something I've been thinking about. So I want to kind of create, or rather I did create, and I'll show you here in a moment, that I made homebrew rules for what I'm calling assassinations, right? So let's go back to the man on the dock with the girl. There is no way that a man holding a knife to someone else's throat while he's got her captive is going to miss. There's just no way, unless he is a complete moron and doesn't know what he's doing and never ever once held anything before with an opposable thumb. If he has the intent to slice this girl's throat, he might not have the stomach for it, he may not have the constitution for it, but there's no way he's going to miss, right? So in order for something to be an assassination, in terms of D&D, it has to be in a situation where you would not roll for an attack. If you, say the rogue, snuck up on some sleeping people around a camp, and he wanted to just quietly use his dagger and assassinate them, stab him in the head or something. Sure, he'd have to roll stealth in order to make sure he got up there without making too much noise and without waking him up, but if he got there and he's just haunched over this sleeping person with a knife in his hand, you're an adventurer who's proficient with that weapon. You're not going to miss a perfectly still target. And in terms of, well, he's lying prone, so he automatically crits. Well, that's fine, but it's a dagger. So the max damage you can do there is 8, in the rolling damage, and then whatever your modifiers are. But if it's even a CR1 monster that's sleeping in the woods, that monster is not dead. This rogue snuck up with a knife, stabbed this dude through the brain. And the guy's like, who's that? What's going on? Why have I been stabbed? What is this pain? Why am I bleeding? Again, you read that in a book or watch it in a movie, that's not going to make any sense. So what I'm proposing is that in that certain situation, it would be an assassination. There's no way for him to miss, so there's no attack roll needed. Next thing is, it has to be a lethal strike. I'm going to explain that a little bit more. But that essentially means it has to be In terms of D&D, I originally was going to say head, neck, or heart, right? But I think I'm going to just say head and neck, because heart really depends on the type of creature you're fighting. Yeah, if it's a human, it's right there, left of center. But if it's a bugbear, I don't know the anatomy of a bugbear as a player or a DM. His heart could be in his foot. I have no idea. If it's a spider, like a giant spider or whatever, or a dragon, or Lord help you, a Tarrasque. No idea where that thing's heart is. So I kind of took heart out of there, just for kind of logistics. It makes a little bit more sense. And the other thing is, in an assassination, it has to be instant death. I don't think that person should have the opportunity to, you've stabbed them in the head, and they just kind of brush it off. There's a lot of things. One thing that comes to mind is the 9th level spell, Finger of Death. That's essentially, you make finger guns at somebody. If they have less than 100 hit points, that creature is dead. They don't go down to 0 hit points. They don't lose any hit points. They just die outright. They're dead. And so that makes me think that that's not the only situation that you could do that. Again, with hit points, it makes sense in battle, but in terms of cool little assassinations, it doesn't make as much sense. So it has to be a lethal strike, an assured hit, and instant death. Let me show you guys what I'm talking about. Let me show you what I got here. This is what I'm talking about. So these are kind of my rules of assassinations. These two right here, they're not going to make a lot of sense to you right off the bat, but that kind of comes from down here. So lethal strikes. A lethal strike cannot be an area of effect attack, or one that would force the target to make a saving throw in order to hit. So this kind of makes sense, right? Lethal attack is different from an assassination. I'm just going to say that right off the bat. I should probably introduce that. A lethal strike is something that you could do in combat, but you're just aiming for the head or neck. So I know a bunch of different DMs kind of homebrew their own sort of way that hits. My DM right now, Danny, he says, if you're going for the head or neck, it's like a -10 to your attack. So there's a bunch of different ways that you can do it. This is just one that I came up with. I think it accounts for a lot of stuff, and it's kind of cool. So again, with the rules of assassination, it has to be an assured hit. So you have to have the knife to her neck. You have to be hunched over a bad guy with a knife in your hand and they don't see you, or something like that. And I'll come back to these right here because those are important when it comes to assassinations. But in order to explain that, I gotta explain those. So lethal strike, you have to roll in order to hit it. You have to roll that d20 and see if you can hit the creature. Because what I have down here is that their lethal areas, head and neck, have an AC. They don't have saving throws. They don't have all this stuff. Let me go over this real quick. AC of lethal areas is 20 plus dex plus proficiency bonus with a minimum of 20. I say this because just about any creature, just instinctively knows whether they are a beast or a god, that their head and neck, kind of important for living and such. That's kind of necessary. Don't want any harm to come to that. And so they're way more able to control their head and neck movements around to avoid attacks. If you hit them with an area of effect attack, that's not like the only part of their body that's getting hit, right? That's not supposed to be a lethal hit. It's just an attack. And I'm not here to rewrite the entire functionality of attacks in D&D. So let's go here. Attacks targeting lethal areas, head and neck, are made at disadvantage if the target is aware of the attacker. So this makes sense, right? You're facing in front of a dude. Think back to like popular sword fights in social media, or in kind of just like pop culture. One that pops into my head is Anakin versus Obi-Wan, or the fight between um, what's his butt and what's its butt in the movie Princess Bride. Inigo Montoya's and the Dread Pirate Rogers or Wesley. I remember their names. You don't have to think I'm a loser. Those are like the two just sword fights that I immediately think of because I think they're fun. Um, but if they're fighting right there with each other, they're going to be way more aware of the fact that like you just lunged for their head or swiped for their neck. It makes way more sense, right? To be able to like, oh, I can dodge that a little easier. And thus the disadvantage. I put C here or otherwise sense because some creatures have blind sight. If a creature doesn't have a head or neck, such as gelatinous cube, the only one I can think of, lethal strikes don't exist. You can't lethally strike something that doesn't have a head or neck when you have to hit its head or neck. Makes sense. So the AC of lethal areas is 20 plus dex plus proficiency bonus. This makes sense to me because as creatures get higher in CR, their proficiency bonus goes up more. It should be more difficult to hit things, like to hit the lethal areas of things if they're a stronger monster, right? So let's go with, for example, really weak monster, a lizard folk. Lizard folk has a +0 to his dex modifier, and because he is less than a CR1, I think he has a proficiency bonus of 1, but anything less than a CR1, I just give a proficiency bonus of 0 to when I'm homebrewing stuff. That might not be right, because I know at level 1 your proficiency bonus is 2 as like a PC, but as a monster, I just kind of say it's 0. That's another homebrew rule of mine. But yeah, so if you're fighting against a lizard folk and you want to cut his head off with your sword, it's going to be a 20 to hit because he doesn't have a dex modifier. His proficiency bonus is 0. So you have to hit a 20. If you're wielding a short sword and you have a plus, I don't know what it would be, like let's just say you have like a +3 to hit total. So you roll the dice and you roll anything less than what would that be, an 18, you're not going to hit it. You roll a 17, that might usually hit your target, but since you declared I'm going to strike for his head or neck, now it misses. And so you can't go back on that. And that makes sense. If you are a barbarian and you have a +11 to hit, there's a pretty good chance you're going to be able to do a lethal strike on this guy. And I think that's good for a few reasons. I think it's good because fighting low-level creatures, sometimes it takes too long. They're definitely totally useful. Don't get me wrong on that. They're great for minions and stuff like that. But that roll is at disadvantage, and at minimum, you have to get above a 20. So, unless you're like a barbarian or a fighter that's got like a huge bonus to his attacks, you probably won't do many lethal strikes. A barbarian might do a bunch of lethal strikes. It just, it's up to you. And the difference is a lizard folk has like either an 11 or a 14 AC, something like that. So the barbarian could just, if you have a +11 to hit, as long as you don't get a nat 1, you're good, dude. So you could take like, I'm definitely going to hit him with my great axe, or I could take a risk and swing for his head maybe. So that's just kind of my thought on that and kind of why I did that. Now, to the important part. You're all seeing this and you're thinking, what the heck is that? Let me explain. So if the strike is successful, the player rolls damage. If the damage rolled is more than half of the max rolled damage possible, the target instantly dies. Let me explain that. So they for sure have hit their target. They rolled at disadvantage. They got above the AC. They're going to hit this thing for sure. But there's a possibility that this person still doesn't die. Now, if they roll more than half the damage, max damage possible, so they're rolling with a d6 as their damage die, they have to get a 4, 5, or 6 on that roll in order for this person to die instantly. They're, depending on the weapon that they're using, their head gets lopped off, their head gets smashed with a warhammer, or a flail just kind of shreds or bashes in their skull, stuff like that. But, as the next thing says, if the damage rolled is half or less than the max damage roll possible, so on a d6, 1, 2, or 3, 3 being half of 6, the target receives 3 times the rolled damage and an effect from the lethal strike table below. So it's a little bit better than rolling a crit, and because it's 3 times the rolled damage, but it's less than half of the max damage possible. So you're not going to get like, I don't know, with 1d6 you're not going to get 18 damage. The max you're going to get is like 9. So it's 3 times rolled damage, but it's handicapped. So I think it works out. And you get an effect from the lethal strike table below. Now, this is a table I kind of came up with. All of this is homebrew, kind of based on the type of damage that someone would be doing. So if you've got a warhammer and you bap somebody upside the head with it, you get that lethal strike, you roll a 1 on your damage die, you give him 3 damage, but you're not going to like blind him. You're not going to like, what you would with a sword, slice someone's eye out. No, because you're doing bludgeoning damage. It's not going to slice, or it's not going to pierce. It's going to bludgeon. So I kind of did it with this. So with acid, normal and dark vision or speech becomes impossible. I did this for acid, fire, piercing, and slashing. And here's my reason why. With acid and fire, acid burns and fire burns. So if you aim for their throat, well, that fire just eats up their throat, right? And so they have a little bit of a hard time breathing, but it just sears their vocal cords. They can't speak anymore. Or you hit them in their face, and it just blinds them. They can't see anything. Their vision is gone. And so that kind of works in those ways with piercing and with slashing. With piercing, you shoot them in the throat, but they don't die. You again hit their vocal cords, and so they're having a hard time speaking. Or you shoot them in the eye, and now they can't see. And with slashing, you slash their throat or you slash across their eyes. They can't see, can't speak. So that's kind of my reasoning behind that. With bludgeoning, they're knocked unconscious for 1 minute. So that kind of makes sense, right? You see somebody in a fight, and he throws his fist into the other guy's jaw, gives him a glass jaw, that dude's knocked out. Like, it's pretty easy to knock someone out, especially if you're wielding like a 5 or 10 pound warhammer, and you're just swinging that around. You hit somebody in the face with that, they're unconscious, dude. Like, they can be super strong, whatever, they're unconscious. You have jarred them. So yeah, bludgeoning is a little OP, but I think it makes sense. Cold, they're petrified in non-magical ice. If you've ever seen The Incredibles, what Frozzo does to that police officer, he just kind of like freezes him, and he's in ice. Now, if you're in the desert and you do cold damage to someone, they freeze into non-magical ice. That ice might melt, and that dude might come back. All the same effects of petrification still work against him. But and you can tweak that. I would probably tweak, instead of resistance to all damage, maybe has vulnerability to all damage, because, well, no, I kind of like the resistance now that I'm thinking about it, because you're not, when you hit that block of ice, I guess it depends on how you see it. If he's now encapsulated in a big block of ice, and there's a few good inches or maybe even a foot of ice before you can hit him, well, you're really just damaging the ice now, aren't you? But if he just still looks like himself, but he becomes frozen, then you're doing massive damage to him. So it's kind of up to you which way you want to do it. If it's your BBEG's minion, do resistant to all damage. If it's kobold, make them vulnerable to all damage. Just kind of get that show on the road. So let's see, we already did fire. Force, very similar to bludgeoning. You're hit with a wall of force, so it knocks you out. Lightning, you're paralyzed for 1 minute. Kind of like what happens if you get struck by lightning. You're just kind of shook. I thought about doing stunned, but stunned is a little OP, so I think paralyzed is a good way to do this. Necrotic. I went back and forth on necrotic for a while. I think gains 1 level of exhaustion makes sense because the actual player's handbook describes necrotic damage as one that, let's see, what were the exact words? It was essentially like decays matter and even soul or something like that. So I kind of interpret that as like it saps your strength, so it makes you kind of exhausted. I thought about maybe it lowers like their overall strength roll, not their modifier, but their roll by 1, but that's just way too much to keep track of because that affects so many things. So just give them a level of exhaustion, it's a little easier. And plus 1 level of exhaustion is not that bad. 2 and more, that's a little bad. Piercing, I already talked about. Poison, they're become poisoned for 1 minute or longer if the attack specifies. I did that because usually when you hit somebody with poison damage, there's like a thing on there where like the creature has to make a Constitution saving throw, and if they take it and they take that throw and they fail it, then they get poisoned. With this, they're just automatically poisoned. That effect automatically takes place. There's no saving throw. But I put it down for a minute. If the attack specifies that they're poisoned for an hour or until greater restoration or something like that, then that effect takes place, and it's not just for a minute. You could do it if you wanted to homebrew it where they're definitely poisoned for a minute and they still make that Constitution saving throw, and if they fail the Constitution saving throw, then they get the additional poisoning for whatever longer. But if they succeed on that Constitution saving throw, they just get poisoned for a minute. It's up to you. Psychic, you're paralyzed for a minute. I read that as like you're getting a huge migraine. You can't take any more input while you're taking this psychic damage, and so you're freaking out. Slashing, we already talked about. Thunder. Thunder's kind of weird for me because I don't know of a thunder damage dealing spell or attack that you have to roll in order to hit, one that's not area of effect. There probably definitely is one. I only have 3 source books and a limited amount of time Googling, so that's not to say there isn't one, and I put it in there just in case. They're knocked prone and they're deafened for a minute. That makes sense to me. Like a thunder wave can knock them back, and then they can't hear anything. I put a note there at the bottom. If more than 1 damage type applies, the player may choose between the appropriate effects. So I have a player that has a sword that deals both slashing damage and necrotic damage. It's magical. So if he hits an enemy with this, rolls less than half on his attack die, he could say, okay, either I could cut through his eyes, and so he can't see anything, or I could have the necrotic damage be the one that affects him, and he could have a level of exhaustion, meaning that all of his attacks against me are going to be at disadvantage, all of his ability checks are at disadvantage, and you can kind of switch between the two. Did I talk about Radiant? Radiant is blinded for 1 minute. You can see that right here. No, I didn't talk about it. I was kind of confused on Radiant. I didn't really have a great way to incorporate that, because I think Radiant damage is something that can be seen as different things depending on the context. Usually, the way that I see it is like holy searing fire or holy searing light. And so with that, I thought, they get hit with a radiant attack. That's hard to like. Radiant and necrotic are kind of hard for me to understand, just like as a human, because like that type of damage doesn't really exist in the world. Like if you start to deteriorate, say like with leprosy, maybe that's necrotic damage. I can kind of see that as kind of like a real world application. But like radiant damage, I can't think of anything. But yeah, that's kind of what I wanted to talk about. That kind of explains the lethal strikes a little bit better. Now let's go back up here, and I'm sure you're all completely enthralled as I give you this lecture. Um, so up here must be a lethal strike. If the target is aware of the attacker's presence during an assassination, now we've come back to assassinations. If the target is aware of the attacker's presence, damage must be rolled. If the outcome is determined according to the rules of a successful lethal strike. I can't speak today. If the target is unaware of the attacker's presence, damage is not rolled. It's just instant death. So that kind of, both of those abide by the rules of lethal strike, successful lethal strike. Because say you're the girl. There's this big old dude, he's got a knife to your throat. If he goes to attack you, there's not really a great way out of this. You're going to get hurt. But there is a chance that maybe he's not holding you right up close to his body. Maybe he's holding you just a few inches out. So as he goes to, this might be a little gory, as he goes to cut your throat, you lean back just a little bit. You get a little bit of wiggle room there. You lean back. So the knife doesn't do as much damage as it would have normally, which is the lower rolled amount. So you still take damage. It still cuts you, but maybe it doesn't cut you enough for you to bleed out. So now you're just can't speak anymore because it hit your throat. And you took a good amount of damage, but you're not dead. Maybe. In the case of the rogue sneaking up on that dude in the forest, he was unaware of his attacker's presence. Damage is not rolled. It's instant death. That dude doesn't take any death saving throws. He doesn't get a chance to scream out his last word. He just dies. And again, this is all homebrew. This is all the way that I have it in my mind. If you want to kind of like change this up, if you want to incorporate this in your game, if you don't want to incorporate this and you think that this is absolutely stupid, I'm sorry. What did I do to hurt you? But yeah, take this, modify it however you want. If you think that some of it's good, some of it's underpowered, some of it's overpowered, absolutely go ahead and change it. Do whatever you want with it. D&D is supposed to be fun, and it's a huge creative outlet for me. I want it to be a creative outlet for you too. But nevertheless, that's kind of my whole spiel today. That's really all that I had prepared. I hope that if anyone sees this, whether now or in the future, and you really like it, I hope you incorporate it. If you like it but you want to tweak it, I hope you tweak it and then incorporate it. And just really let your creativity shine. Being a DM is much more than just babysitting a bunch of people all wanting to have the spotlight at the same time. It's a way to express your creative talents, stretch all the things that you can do in D&D. Like, as a player in D&D, you're told that you can do just about anything. As a DM in D&D, you can do absolutely anything. You can abide strictly by the rules, or you can throw the rule books out into the rain and say, we're doing this my way. You can do whatever you want. But make sure you're having fun. Make sure you're having fun. Make sure your players are having fun. Make sure everyone at the table is having a good time. Because at the end of the day, that's why we do that.